Picture this. It's 1829, and beneath the sacred peaks of what we now call the Gila River region, a baby takes his first breath. His name is Guerrilla, which means one who yawns, and if you had been there that day, watching his mother swaddle him in the shadow of those ancient mountains, you would have witnessed something extraordinary. Not because you could see the future written on that infant's face, but because you were watching the birth of a man who would become so feared, so legendary, that his enemies would scream the name of a Christian saint just to feel safe. But here's the thing that makes Geronimo's story so fascinating and so tragic. For 30 full years, this boy grew up living exactly as his ancestors had for centuries. Think about that timeline for a moment. 30 years. That's longer than most of us have held the same job, lived in the same house, or even maintained the same circle of friends. And during all of that time, Guerrilla lived a life that was, well, it was beautifully ordinary. The Apache bands moved freely across landscapes that today we carve up with state lines Arizona, New Mexico, Mexico itself. But to them, these were just seasonal paths, as natural as a river flowing to the sea. Summer meant the cool mountains, where the air was thin and the hunting was good. Winter meant the protected valleys, where the wind couldn't find you and the springs never froze. They planted corn and melons, traded peacefully with Mexican settlements, and lived according to rhythms that had been refined over generations. Now, when we talk about Apache life in the 1830s and 40s, we need to understand something crucial. These weren't nomadic wanderers scratching out a survival existence. The Apache had developed one of the most sophisticated relationships with harsh desert and mountain terrain that human beings have ever achieved. They knew every water source across thousands of square miles, and I mean every single one. They could find sustenance in places where modern survival experts would die of thirst in 3 days. Guerrilla learned all of this. He learned to read the land like you and I read street signs. He learned which plants would heal wounds, which berries were safe to eat, how to track a deer through terrain that would leave most people lost within an hour. But he also learned the peaceful arts. He learned to tend crops, to make things with his hands, to participate in the intricate social networks that bound Apache bands together across vast distances. And then he fell in love. Her name was Alope, and by all accounts, she was his childhood sweetheart. Can you imagine it? Growing up in one of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth, learning the skills that connected you directly to that land, and finding the person you wanted to share it all with. They married, and she bore him 3 children. 3 children who would learn their father's skills, who would carry forward the ancient knowledge, who represented the continuation of a way of life that had endured for centuries. For 30 years, this was Guerrilla's world. 30 years of following the seasonal patterns, of raising his family, of being a productive member of his community. If he had died of old age in his bed, which, given Apache life expectancy in those days, would have meant living to perhaps 50 or 60, he would have been forgotten by history. Just another Apache man who lived and died according to the ancient ways. But history had other plans. See, while Guerrilla was raising his corn and his children, while he was learning the traditional healing songs and participating in the ceremonies that connected his people to the sacred mountains, something massive was happening in the larger world. The Mexican-American War had just ended in 1848, and suddenly the political map was being redrawn around him. Mexico had lost half its territory to the United States, and these Apache lands, these places where families had lived according to seasonal patterns for centuries, suddenly found themselves at the intersection of 2 different empires, both of which had very different ideas about what should happen to the people who were already there. But none of that mattered to Guerrilla in 1858. What mattered to him was that he and the other men had traveled to a Mexican town to trade just as they had done countless times before. Trade relationships with Mexican settlements went back generations. These weren't raids or attacks, this was commerce, the kind of peaceful interaction that had allowed both communities to thrive. The camp at Cusquiller was where they had left their families. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be temporary. The women and children were there, along with the elderly, waiting for the men to return with the goods they had traded for. It was such a routine arrangement that no one worried about it. No one except Colonel José María Carrasco. Now, you have to understand the mindset here. Carrasco was operating under Mexican military doctrine that saw Apache people as obstacles to be removed, not neighbors to be lived with. And he had discovered something that, from his perspective, was an opportunity too good to pass up. An Apache camp temporarily defended only by women, children, and old people. What happened next changed everything. When Guerrilla and the other men returned from their trading expedition, they found silence. You know that kind of silence, don't you? The silence that tells you something terrible has happened before you even know what it is. The silence where your brain starts frantically trying to explain why the normal sounds of life, children playing, women talking, dogs barking, are completely absent. And then they saw the bodies. Guerrilla's mother, his wife Alope, his 3 children, the people who had been his entire world, cut down by Carrasco's soldiers in what the Mexicans would later justify as a preemptive strike against potential Apache raiders. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that still gives me chills, because what happened that night, alone in the wilderness with his grief, would echo through the next 30 years of American frontier history. Guerrilla later described experiencing a vision, a voice that spoke to him in his darkest moment and made him a promise that would shape everything that came after. The voice told him that no bullet would ever kill him, that he would walk through battles like smoke through trees, that his enemies would fear him in ways they had never feared another man. And you know what? For the next 30 years, against impossible odds, facing thousands of soldiers from 2 different nations, that promise held true. But that night, as he sat alone with his dead, the peaceful farmer named Guerrilla died along with his family. What rose from that devastation was something else entirely, something that would become the stuff of legend and nightmare, depending on which side of the conflict you found yourself on. When he launched his first revenge raid into Mexico, seeking the soldiers who had destroyed his world, his weapons broke during the fighting. But Guerrilla didn't retreat. Armed with only a knife, he carved through soldier after soldier with such terrifying efficiency that the surviving Mexicans, in their panic and terror, screamed for divine protection. "Geronimo!" they cried. "Geronimo!" calling on San Geronimo, St. Jerome, to save them from this Apache demon who seemed unstoppable, invulnerable, inhuman in his ferocity. The name stuck. From that moment forward, the man who had once been known as "one who yawns" would be called by the name his enemies had given him in their fear. But here's the question that should be haunting you right now. What happens when a man who has mastered one of the most challenging environments on Earth, who has been promised by the spirits that no bullet can kill him, who has absolutely nothing left to lose, finds himself caught between 2 expanding empires that both want his people gone? What happens when that kind of man decides that if he's going to die anyway, he's going to make his enemies pay a price they'll never forget? By 1861, as Americans turned their guns on each other in the bloodiest war their young nation had ever seen, Geronimo had become something that shouldn't have been possible. Think about this for a moment. While the Union and Confederacy were mobilizing armies of hundreds of thousands, while they were building the industrial machinery of modern warfare, while they were revolutionizing military logistics and communication, one Apache warrior was making both the United States and Mexico look like bumbling amateurs. How do you explain that? How do you explain a man who could lead raids that defied every principle of military logic, who left seasoned commanders staring at maps and questioning their own sanity? The answer lies in understanding something that most people today have completely forgotten. The Apache way of war wasn't just about tactics. It was about something much deeper, something that combined practical battlefield skills with spiritual power in ways that multiplied their effectiveness far beyond what simple mathematics would suggest. Let me paint you a picture of what an Apache warrior represented by the time Geronimo hit his stride. These men, and yes, women like Lozan, who we'll talk about in a moment, had been trained from childhood to do things that would seem superhuman to us today. They could run 70 miles without stopping. 70 miles. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 3 marathons back to back. And they weren't just running on paved roads with hydration stations every few miles. They were covering some of the most brutal terrain on Earth, through deserts where the temperature could swing 50 degrees between day and night, across mountains where a single wrong step could send you tumbling into a canyon. But the running was just the beginning. Apache warriors knew every water source across thousands of square miles of territory. And when I say every water source, I mean hidden springs that you could walk within 50 feet of and never notice, seasonal pools that appeared only after specific weather patterns, underground seeps that required digging in exactly the right spot. They could find water where Mexican and American soldiers would die of thirst, and that alone made them nearly invincible in their home territory. The terrain itself was their greatest weapon. While cavalry horses stumbled and went lame on rocky ground, Apache warriors moved through landscapes that seemed designed to kill anything on 4 legs. They knew secret paths through mountain ranges that others considered impassable, canyons where a handful of defenders could hold off entire companies, hidden valleys where they could rest and regroup while their enemies searched in circles 50 miles away. But here's where it gets really interesting. Under leaders like Cochise, Victorio, and Geronimo, Apache bands didn't just operate as independent groups of raiders. They maintained coordination across hundreds of miles in ways that still puzzle military historians today. How did they do it? How did bands separated by vast distances manage to strike simultaneously, to coordinate complex operations without any of the communication technologies that armies depended on? Part of the answer was practical. An intricate network of signal fires, hidden message caches, and runners who could cover impossible distances. But part of it was something else entirely, something that gets to the heart of what made Apache warriors so terrifyingly effective. Enter Lozan, Geronimo's warrior sister, a woman who possessed what the Apache called power. Now, before you roll your eyes and dismiss this as primitive superstition, consider this. Lozan could stand with her arms outstretched, close her eyes, and tell you which direction enemies were approaching from miles away. Her palms would tingle, grow warm, point like a compass toward danger that conventional scouts couldn't detect. Was this supernatural, divine intervention, or was it something more subtle, a combination of heightened senses, intimate knowledge of the land, and subconscious processing of environmental cues that allowed her to detect the presence of large groups of men and horses at extraordinary distances? Honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it worked, again and again and again. And Lozan wasn't unique. Apache warriors carried sacred pollen and sang protection songs that genuinely seemed to deflect bullets. Whether through divine intervention or the absolute confidence that made them move unpredictably in battle, they survived encounters that should have killed them. They developed a reputation for being unkillable, and that reputation became a weapon in itself. Because here's the thing about psychological warfare, it doesn't require supernatural powers, just the ability to convince your enemies that you might possess them. The Apache became masters of creating phantom armies. They would leave false trails that split in a dozen different directions, build dummy camps with smoking fires to suggest large bands where none existed, strike settlements simultaneously hundreds of miles apart until terrified settlers believed thousands of Apache roamed the territory, when perhaps only 200 warriors were actually operating in scattered bands. Let me give you a specific example that shows just how effective these tactics could be. The Second Battle of Apache Pass in 1862. Geronimo and Cochise, working together, held off 2,000 California volunteers with just 500 warriors. 2,000 against 500, those should be impossible odds. But the Apache used the terrain so effectively, struck from so many different directions with such perfect timing, that the American soldiers reported facing thousands of enemies. The battle reports from that engagement read like something out of a fever dream. Officers described being attacked from positions that should have been impossible to reach, by warriors who seemed to appear and disappear like smoke. They reported being fired upon from cliff tops that required hours to climb, only to arrive and find them empty. They described pursuing bands of raiders who simply vanished into the landscape, leaving no tracks, no sign of passage. And this wasn't just military victory, it was economic warfare on a scale that the Apache understood perfectly. Every American soldier deployed against them cost the government $50 per month. $50. At a time when a working man might make $20 for an entire month's labor. Every fort built to contain them required massive supply trains vulnerable to attack. Every burned ranch, every stolen cattle herd, every abandoned settlement made the project of Western expansion economically unviable. The Apache were bleeding two nations white, and they were doing it with a force that could fit comfortably in a few modern city blocks. They had turned the vastness and harshness of the American Southwest into a weapon system that multiplied their power far beyond what their numbers alone could account for. But here's what makes this story so compelling and so tragic. The Apache weren't fighting for conquest. They weren't trying to build an empire or expand their territory. They were fighting for something much simpler and much more profound, the right to exist as they always had, in the places where their ancestors were buried, according to the customs that gave their lives meaning. They had become the most effective guerrilla fighters in American history, almost by accident, out of sheer necessity. And as 1861 turned into 1862, as the American Civil War raged and drew military resources away from the frontier, it seemed like they might actually succeed in preserving their way of life through pure military excellence. But empires don't give up easily, and the United States was about to send someone west who would change everything about this conflict. A general who understood that beating the Apache would require abandoning every conventional military wisdom and learning to fight them on their own terms. The question was, could even the greatest guerrilla fighters in the world survive what was coming next? Everything changed in 1871, when President Ulysses S. Grant made a decision that would reshape the entire Apache conflict. He appointed General George Crook to subdue the Apache. And if you know anything about military history, you'll recognize why this was such a pivotal moment. Crook wasn't just another cavalry officer trained to fight conventional European-style battles. He was something much more dangerous from the Apache perspective. He was a student, while his predecessors had relied on the same tired tactics that had been failing for decades, sending large columns of cavalry charging across the desert, establishing forts that the Apache simply avoided, trying to fight a guerrilla war with conventional military doctrine. Crook did something revolutionary. He studied his enemy. Think about what that means for a moment. For the first time in decades of conflict, an American military leader was approaching the Apache not as savage obstacles to be swept aside, but as master tacticians whose methods needed to be understood, analyzed, and countered with equal sophistication. Crook spent months learning how Apache bands moved, where they found water, how they communicated across vast distances. He mapped their seasonal patterns, studied their social structures, and most importantly, he figured out their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Their greatest strength, as we've discussed, was their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their ability to move through it like ghosts. Their greatest weakness? They were still human beings who needed food, water, and shelter, and there were only so many places in the harsh southwestern landscape where all three could be found reliably. So Crook did something that previous commanders had considered unthinkable. He employed Apache scouts. Not just a few, but dozens of them. Apache men who had grown tired of the endless fighting, who had lost families to the conflict, who wanted to find a way to end the bloodshed, even if it meant working with the US military. These scouts knew every hiding place, every water source, every secret trail that their kinsmen might use. But Crook made another crucial innovation that showed just how deeply he understood the nature of this conflict. Instead of relying on wagon trains that could barely navigate rough terrain, he equipped his forces with pack mules. Hundreds of them. Suddenly, American forces could pursue Apache bands into their mountain strongholds, could follow them through terrain that had previously been off-limits to military operations. The results were devastating for the Apache. For the first time, their secret refuges were being discovered. Their hidden camps were being raided. Warriors who had spent decades moving freely through landscapes they considered impregnable found themselves being hunted by enemies who seemed to know their every move. And yet, Crook understood something that would make him unique among American military leaders of his era. He treated Apache customs with respect. He negotiated in good faith. He kept his word when he gave it. The Apache began calling him Grey Wolf, not because he was cruel, but because he was a formidable predator who nonetheless commanded respect. By 1875, even Geronimo had surrendered to reservation life. Think about that for a moment. The man who had spent 17 years making two nations look foolish, who had survived dozens of battles and hundreds of skirmishes, who had become the most feared name on the American frontier, had finally accepted that the war was over, and for a brief moment it looked like peace might actually work. But then politics intervened, in the form of what historians now call the Indian Ring, a network of government suppliers who had discovered that there was enormous money to be made in providing goods and services to Native American reservations. The more they could steal from Apache rations, the more profit they could pocket. Beef that was supposed to feed Apache families mysteriously disappeared. Blankets promised by treaty never arrived. Tools needed for farming were sold elsewhere. The Apache found themselves trapped on reservations where they couldn't practice their traditional way of life, but also couldn't survive on the government rations they'd been promised. It was a deliberate policy designed to make life so miserable that Apache people would simply disappear. But the cultural destruction went even deeper. Government officials banned Tiswin, the traditional Apache beer that played a central role in religious ceremonies. They forbade traditional dances and healing rituals. They dragged Apache children away to boarding schools hundreds of miles away, where speaking their native language earned savage beatings, where they were taught that everything their parents had ever told them about the world was primitive nonsense. The philosophy behind these schools was summed up in a phrase that still makes my skin crawl. Kill the Indian, save the man. The idea was to completely erase Apache identity, to turn Apache children into dark-skinned copies of white Americans who would be ashamed of their heritage and eager to abandon it. And then, in 1881, came the breaking point. At Sibecue Creek, the army hanged an unlated rage. Apache medicine man named Nochaidel Kline, whose only crime was preaching that traditional Apache ways could coexist with the new reality. The execution was meant to demonstrate American power and the futility of clinging to the old ways. Instead, it ignited the final Apache rebellion. The reservations exploded. Bands that had accepted peace for years suddenly disappeared into the mountains, and leading them, now 70 years old but still burning with the fury that had driven him for decades, was Geronimo. What followed from 1885 to 1886 would become the stuff of American legend. With just 36 warriors, including the incredible 70-year-old Nana, who could still outride cavalry officers half his age, Geronimo led 5,000 American soldiers, 3,000 Mexican troops, and 500 Apache scouts on an epic chase across two nations. 5,000 American soldiers, 3,000 Mexicans, 500 Apache scouts, nearly 9,000 men, equipped with the latest military technology, supported by telegraph networks and supply lines, backed by the full resources of two industrial nations, all hunting 36 Apache warriors, and for over a year, those 36 men made them all look like fools. General Crook deployed heliograph mirrors, an innovative signaling system that used reflected sunlight to send messages across vast distances instantaneously. Telegraph lines carried coordination orders to military posts throughout the Southwest. The most sophisticated communication network ever created for frontier warfare was focused on capturing one small band of Apache fighters, but Geronimo seemed to possess supernatural knowledge of troop movements. Apache raiders struck ranches in Arizona at dawn and attacked Mexican settlements by nightfall, covering distances through waterless deserts and freezing mountains that should have been impossible. They moved like smoke through landscapes that killed unprepared travelers, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. The human cost of this campaign was mounting horrifically, but not in the way you might expect. Battle deaths remained surprisingly low on all sides. The Apache were too skilled to be caught in conventional engagements, and they were too few to sustain heavy casualties. No, the real casualties were the Apache families. The army had learned that the most effective way to force warrior surrenders was to imprison their wives and children. Apache women and children who had lived peacefully on reservations for years were rounded up and shipped to prison camps in Florida. The message was clear: surrender or your families will die in captivity. General Crook, the Grey Wolf, who had earned Apache respect through honorable conduct, found himself caught between his own sense of honor and political pressure from Washington. When his attempts to negotiate an honorable surrender were undermined by politicians demanding unconditional submission, Crook resigned in disgust. His replacement was General Nelson Miles, a man who had no interest in honor or Apache respect. Miles understood that what Washington wanted was not military victory. They wanted the complete destruction of Apache resistance, and if that required treachery, so be it. The end came at Skeleton Canyon in September 1886. Miles lured Geronimo to a meeting with promises of a short imprisonment before returning to Arizona. The promises were written on paper, official documents that seemed to guarantee the safety and eventual return of the Apache people. But paper promises have a way of blowing away like dust in the desert wind. What happened next would prove that sometimes the real defeat comes not in battle, but in the moment when a warrior realizes that the entire world has changed around him, and that everything he had been fighting for was already gone. The surrender at Skeleton Canyon marked not an ending, but a transformation so complete and so cruel that it defies easy comprehension. Those promises Miles had made, the ones about a short imprisonment, before returning to Arizona, turned out to be exactly what anyone who had been paying attention to American Indian policy should have expected. They were lies, not misunderstandings, not bureaucratic confusion, but deliberate, calculated lies designed to end Apache resistance once and for all. Instead of the promised 2 years, Geronimo and his followers were immediately shipped to Florida as prisoners of war. But here's the truly diabolical part. It wasn't just the warriors who had surrendered. The Apache scouts who had helped hunt Geronimo, the families who had lived peacefully on reservations for years, even Apache people who had never participated in any fighting at all, they were all loaded onto the same trains, heading east into an exile that would last decades. Fort Marion, Florida. Picture this if you can. Apache people who had evolved over centuries to thrive in the dry mountains and high deserts of the Southwest, people whose entire culture was built around the relationship between human beings and a specific landscape, were now imprisoned in the humid swamps of Florida. The climate alone was a form of torture. Imagine taking someone from Arizona and locking them in what was essentially a steam bath, where the air was so thick and wet that every breath felt like drowning. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what the climate did to their health. Tuberculosis ripped through the Apache prisoners like wildfire. These were people whose immune systems had been shaped by the clean, dry air of high-altitude deserts. They had no defenses against the tropical diseases that flourished in Florida's oppressive humidity. Warriors who had survived decades of combat, who had endured starvation and thirst and exposure in some of the harshest terrain on Earth, were killed by microbes they couldn't even see. The family separations were deliberately designed to break Apache social structures. Children were torn away from their parents and shipped to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where the motto was that chilling phrase we mentioned earlier, "Kill the Indian, save the man." At Carlisle, Apache children were beaten for speaking their native language, had their hair cut off, were dressed in military-style uniforms, and were systematically taught to be ashamed of everything their families had ever taught them. Half of those children would die of disease and despair, never seeing their families again. Think about that statistic for a moment. Half. An entire generation of Apache culture was being deliberately destroyed, one child at a time, in the name of civilization and progress. And yet, even in captivity, even facing cultural genocide, Geronimo adapted. He adapted with the same tactical brilliance he had shown in war, the same relentless creativity that had kept him alive through 30 years of conflict. If America was going to make him a prisoner, he would become the most famous prisoner in American history. Transferred eventually to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which was at least dry, if not home, the greatest Apache warrior became America's most famous Indian. He learned to sign his name, something he had never needed to do in his previous life. He sold photographs for $2 each at World's Fairs, turning his own legend into a source of income. He posed in automobiles and formal suits, playing the role of the tamed savage for audiences hungry for a glimpse of the vanishing frontier. In 1905, he rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade while technically still a prisoner of war. Think about the symbolism there. The man who had humiliated two nations, who had made American military might look foolish for decades, was now being displayed as proof of American triumph over the wilderness. He was a living trophy, a breathing museum, exhibit representing a way of life that was supposed to be extinct. But here's what makes this story so complex, so layered with meaning that still resonates today. Geronimo understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't broken by captivity, he was playing a different kind of game, using different tactics for a different kind of survival. By becoming famous, by maintaining his dignity even while being displayed like a curiosity, he was ensuring that the Apache story wouldn't be forgotten. He was waging cultural war by other means. The old warrior spent his final years at Fort Sill, dictating his autobiography to S.M. Barrett, a process that revealed the depth of his strategic thinking even in old age. He chose carefully what stories to tell, and which ones to keep secret. He presented himself not as a bloodthirsty savage, which is how American propaganda had portrayed him, but as a patriot defending his homeland, a family man seeking justice for murdered relatives, a leader trying to preserve his people's way of life against impossible odds. He tended his garden, growing watermelons and corn with the same attention to detail he had once applied to planning raids. He attended the Dutch Reformed Church services, not because he had abandoned Apache spiritual beliefs, but because he understood that accommodation and resistance could coexist. He learned to navigate the modern world while never abandoning his identity as an Apache. But through it all, he dreamed of Arizona, those sacred mountains where his childhood had been spent, where his ancestors were buried, where the air was thin and clean, and the spirits of the land spoke in voices he understood. The government refused to let him return, even as an 80-year-old man, because they feared his presence would inspire new resistance among Apache people still living on southwestern reservations. When pneumonia claimed him in February 1909, he allegedly confessed to his nephew that surrendering had been his greatest mistake. But was it really? Or was that just the regret of an old man who knew he would never see home again? Because here's the thing about Geronimo's final victory, the one that took decades to become clear. Apache culture survived every attempt to destroy it. The children who were supposed to forget their heritage remembered it. The language that was beaten out of them in schools was kept alive in whispers and secret conversations. The ceremonies that were banned were performed in hidden places where government officials couldn't find them. His tactical innovations influenced guerrilla fighters worldwide, from Lawrence of Arabia, who studied Apache methods in the Arabian desert, to Vietnamese generals who used similar techniques against American forces half a century later. Military academies still study Geronimo's campaigns as examples of how a smaller force can neutralize the advantages of a larger, more technologically advanced enemy. And today, Apache nations thrive with casinos and businesses on lands the government once considered worthless. They govern themselves according to their own laws, educate their children in their own languages, and practice ceremonies their great-grandfathers were forbidden to perform. The spirit of adaptation and resistance that Geronimo embodied, the refusal to simply disappear, the determination to survive and transform rather than surrender, never truly surrendered at all. The greatest Apache warrior understood something that his captors never did, that true victory isn't always measured in battles won or territory held, but in the simple, profound act of continuing to exist, of maintaining identity and dignity even when the entire world conspires against you. In the end, perhaps that was Geronimo's greatest raid of all, stealing a future for his people from the very jaws of cultural extinction.